It is not for him to pride himself who loveth his own country, but rather for him who loveth the whole world. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Baha'u'llah. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. Baha'u'llah.
Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, said, Baha'u'llah taught that an equal standard of human rights must be recognized and adopted. In the estimation of God, all men are equal. There is no distinction or preferment for any soul in the dominion of his justice and equity.
Thank you so much. So now I'll introduce our speaker for today, and just a reminder to please save all your questions until after the talk when we'll have our Q&A session. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please fill out the Google form that we'll put in the chat below. Our speaker this week is Dr. Payam Akhavan, and his topic is, what are Baha'is doing to address human rights violations around the world? Professor Payam Akhavan is a former UN prosecutor at The Hague, a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and counsel before the International Court of Justice. He earned his PhD from Harvard Law School and teaches at the University of Toronto with prior appointments at McGill, Yale, Oxford, and Paris. He served with the UN in Bosnia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and Guatemala, and is author of the best-selling book, In Search of a Better World, A Human Rights Odyssey. His human rights work has been featured globally, including the New York Times, BBC Hard Talk, CBC Ideas, and acclaimed documentary films. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Akhavan.
Thank you very much, Bayan, and to the Parhami family for this invitation, and greetings from London. I am very honored to share with you some thoughts today about human rights in a world of extremes. And it's that world of extremes into which the Baha'i faith was born in the middle of the 19th century in what was then the Persian Empire, which we know today by the name of Iran. And the Baha'i faith, from its very beginning, espoused the ideal of the oneness of humankind, of the unification of all peoples in one world civilization, the civilization based not merely on formal notions of equality, whether between the races, religions, men and women, but rather an all-embracing civilization based on the organic unity and interdependence of all peoples, and a civilization based on spiritual principles that saw human beings as inherently noble beings rather than consumers of material goods. And I want to begin with this summary of the basic ethos of the Baha'i faith to explain how revolutionary these ideas would have been in the 19th century in the Middle East, let alone in today's world. And because of this revolutionary new idea, which was not merely a set of ideals, but a historical view about where humankind would evolve towards in the coming decades and centuries. Because of this view, which upset the prevailing worldviews of the time, the Baha'is in Iran were and continue to be subject to a campaign of hatred, violence, and persecutions. And that persecution itself, I think, tells us much about the contrast between light and darkness, if you like, in today's world, the contrast between an old world order, which is divisive and unjust, and which is crumbling before our eyes, while a new world order founded on that vision of the unification of all peoples of the world is simultaneously being born. I mention this because these were the principles and teachings that I was brought up with in my childhood in Iran. I was born in Tehran, and when I was 9 years old, my parents told me that we would be going to a place called Canada. I had no idea where Canada was at the time or why we had to leave our beautiful life and our friends and family in Iran to go to this place where some of my friends at school told me everyone lived in igloos. As the reality set that we were going to travel to this new country, the idea of exile, of persecution, of human rights was still an abstract concept for me as a child of 9 years of age. When we arrived in Canada, of course, it was quite a culture shock. And of course, I saw the world through the prism of a 9-year-old. And I remember seeing for the first time color television, which I found absolutely fascinating. And I remember watching for the first time a John Wayne film and being so surprised that in addition to my mother tongue of Persian, John Wayne also spoke English. Because of course, we had only seen all of these films dubbed. In the schoolyard, I was one of 2 brown children. And in the midst of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the hostage crisis, of course, I became personally answerable for all of the crimes that were committed by the Islamic fundamentalists, not able to explain to my friends in school that our family left because we had no choice, because in our country of origin, we did not have human rights, we did not have equality, we did not have the protection of the law. And it was especially painful to witness from a distance loved ones, the fathers of friends and family members who in those difficult years were arrested, tortured, and many of them executed. I begin this because when we speak about human rights, very often we understand it as an abstraction. We can speak about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. We can speak about international law, we can speak about equality. But my experience is that until we experience injustice, we will never understand why justice is important. It is said that a single murder is a tragedy, but 1 million murders is a statistic. We are not primed to understand the world in terms of intellectual abstractions. It is that deeper sense of self, our capacity to connect with suffering and injustice, with the pain of others, perhaps what we call in our society empathy, that is the beginning of any journey from complacence and indifference about the injustices of the world to a life that is committed to, so to say, doing something about it, to becoming involved in reimagining the world and leaving behind a reality better than the one we have inherited. So my journey began not just with these teachings that I was brought up with in a Baha'i household, but with the experience of helplessness, the helplessness of seeing innocent people tortured and executed simply because of their beliefs, and especially when those beliefs were a vision for a better world, a world in which all human beings were united in a shared sense of humanity. But perhaps the event that affected me the most was when I was 16 years of age, and I heard that one of my contemporaries, also 16 years of age, by the name of Mona Mahmoud Nejad, a high school student, had been arrested and imprisoned simply because she had dared to write a high school essay in which she demanded her human rights, in which she decried the persecution of the Baha'i minority to which she belonged. And for that supposed crime of speaking truth to power, Mona spent several months in prison, following which in the summer of 1983, she and 9 other women in the city of Shiraz were hanged. As a 16-year-old immigrant adolescent trying to fit in with Canadian mainstream culture, the idea of human rights was the furthest thing away from my mind. But when news came of Mona's execution, it shattered my world of complacence. And I looked at my own reality in Canada, North America, society in which I enjoyed freedom, prosperity, and opportunity. And I asked myself, what is my freedom and prosperity and opportunity worth if it is wasted on selfish mediocrity? I had a very difficult time reconciling the heroic sacrifice of Mona, who was just at the prime of her life, of trying to grasp the reality that the only thing that distinguished us is that my family emigrated to Canada while hers remained behind in Iran, reflecting on the fact that I could just as well have been Mona, my life extinguished at the prime of my youth. I had a great difficulty reconciling that reality of oppression and injustice and resistance to this inhumanity with the consumer culture in which I lived, where superficiality was celebrated, where human beings were really seen as a bundle of appetites waiting to be served through the consumption of material goods, through endless entertainment. And I decided at that moment that I could not turn my back to the sacrifice that Mona had made. And that sacrifice brought to life for me those lofty ideals and teachings that the greatest station that a human being can aspire towards is to be a servant of humanity, which is quite the contrary to the narcissistic, self-obsessed culture that we have, where everything is about feeding our ego instead of our soul, where we are told that life is about instant gratification, superficial pleasures, rather than sacrifice and struggle. That was the beginning for me of a journey on the path of redemption, where I would find many others who were broken, people who were broken by searing pain of loss, each with their own story. When I finished law school, I decided that I would become a human rights lawyer. This at a time when most of my colleagues were earning obscene salaries on Wall Street, and I was struggling from one poorly paid, insecure job to another. And this was in 1990, the year before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which radically changed the world as I had known it. And while the end of the Cold War was seen as a turning point, and I remember President Bush, the senior, speaking about a new world order. I remember Francis Fukuyama, the philosopher, who published a book called The End of History, because the assumption was that with the end of the Soviet bloc, with the end of communism, Western liberalism would embrace the whole planet, and this would be in effect the end of history, the consummation of our social evolution as a species. And I must admit that I too bought into that illusion that Western liberalism, which was not just about freedom and human rights and the rule of law, which are all excellent ideals for which we have shed a lot of blood, in effect, historically, to achieve. But I also, at that point, perhaps did not see that this same Western liberal world that was so vaunted, in which we were so complacent, about which we were so triumphant, would soon begin to unravel. Around this time, in a place that was then called Yugoslavia, a civil war broke out, which was characterized by the horrors of so-called ethnic cleansing. It was, as is the case with most other instances of genocidal violence, a case of political leaders who manipulated and instrumentalized divisions in society as a means of elevating themselves to positions of power, with the catastrophic consequence of ethnic war. And I think today we see, even in our own midst, the fact that no society is immune from the threat of not just divisive politics, but of populist hatred, which is always one step away from catastrophic violence. And it is said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. In Yugoslavia, where as a young man, I witnessed unspeakable crimes, unspeakable suffering, the idea was born for the first time in the history of the United Nations that those who are perpetrators of crimes against humanity must be held to account. And it's shocking that until the United Nations established its first war crimes tribunal in 1993, it was more likely that you would be arrested for stealing a bicycle than for committing genocide. So this basic idea that the perpetrators of such crimes must be held to account, even if they were powerful leaders, was a revolutionary moment in the history of international law. And I found myself at a young age as a war crimes prosecutor in The Hague. The year after the tribunal was established, in 1994, in an African country called Rwanda, some 1 million people were killed in just 3 months while the world stood by and watched. In fact, there were 2,500 UN peacekeepers in Rwanda, but instead of helping save the hapless victims, the United Nations decided to withdraw the peacekeepers and leave the Tutsi minority, who were the targets of this violence, to be slaughtered with impunity. I share with you some of these formative experiences because, once again, being on the ground and seeing these realities, you feel an instinctive sense of rage and grief. Because the reason why these crimes happen, and we have to bear in mind that the greatest injustices of our times are not natural disasters like an earthquake or a tsunami, but they are man-made disasters. They're political choices. They happen because people allow themselves to be manipulated and to be led down the road to hell. And because the rest of the world stands by as spectator, as bystanders, indifferent to the suffering of others, unwilling to intervene, until we realize that when we speak about the interdependence of humankind, when we say that the welfare of one part affects the welfare of the whole, this is not just some naive, far-fetched fantasy. It's an inescapable reality. If we ignore the suffering of others, if we are imprisoned in our own ego, and we are indifferent to what happens to the world around us, if we are ignorant about the injustices of the world and turn our back to them, we will inevitably pay a price. So to me today, the idea of the unification of humankind has taken on a very different meaning. I've seen time and again how cynical political leaders who are obsessed simply with their own power and fortunes, and masses of people who are indifferent and ignorant and who don't care about anything except their own immediate selfish needs, are all complicit in the same injustices that we only take notice of when we realize that we ourselves are at the edge of the precipice about to fall off. I mention this because the Baha'i view of history and where we are today is one of optimism and hope. What we're witnessing today are twin processes: the destruction of an old world order, divisive and materialistic in its conception of human nature. And we should not be surprised if a belief system which sees human beings as incorrigibly selfish, aggressive, competitive, and materialistic is going to lead us to a dead end. And that is what we're witnessing in the world today, the unraveling of that system and the emergence of a new consciousness. Not only that we must set aside all which divides us across the lines of race and gender and class and all of the isms which have caused such catastrophic loss and suffering throughout history, but in a more fundamental sense, that we are essentially spiritual creatures. That when we speak about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of happiness is not about a consumer culture which creates alienation and isolation and environmental catastrophe, but that the pursuit of happiness in a deeper sense is about retrieving the profound spiritual capacities that we each have as human beings. And ironically, I came to that conclusion not by living a life of ease and comfort, but by seeing the survivors of injustice and ethnic cleansing and genocide, people whose lives had been destroyed, but who in their demand for justice demonstrated the astonishing resilience of the human spirit. How interesting that in a society of excessive comfort, we sink more and more into misery, anxiety, depression, and stress, whereas people who often have lost everything have a greater sense of resilience and hope. That should tell us something about the choices that we make and the kind of future that we wish to build. So I think that in my estimation, the forces of history are leaving us no choice but to radically reimagine not just the future, but also reevaluate our sense of self as human beings. And each and every one of us are now under an obligation, in a sense, to decide which side of history we want to be on. Some time ago, I read the remarkable testimony of Chief Metuktire, who's of the Kayapo people in Brazilian Amazonia. And he was speaking about the massive fires that are destroying his ancestral home in the midst of the rainforest. And he said that you are destroying our home, and by destroying our home, you will destroy yours as well. In his language, the word for money is dead leaves, because as he said, it's a dead and useless thing. And perhaps just as we become so exceptionally advanced technologically, just as we live in the most prosperous period of human history, we have to go back in time and retrieve that innocence which we left behind before we polluted our mind and our soul with this materialistic ideology, which is now bringing us for the first time in history to the point of self-destruction. Arnold Toynbee famously said that civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide. For us, changing our way of life, having a spiritual rebirth, is not a luxury. It's not about going to a yoga retreat or buying a Headspace app. It's a question of survival. We have no choice. We have no choice but to radically reimagine the world, to embrace the inextricable oneness of humankind, and above all, to discover the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and our capacity for spiritual transformation. I think that I will, at this point, end my comments, and I hope that what I've conveyed to you is the idea that we cannot take for granted that today we have the idea of universal human rights as a set of unifying principles. It is because of thousands of years of war, violence, and persecution that we have arrived at this remarkable point in human history. And I would encourage all of us to consider that despite the turmoil around us, which very often can be a source of distress and despair, that we in fact are living in one of the most exceptional periods of human history, a period which the prophets and poets and visionaries of the past spoke about, when we would finally achieve world peace, simply because we have no other choice. I thank once again the Parhami family for this kind invitation. And with those remarks, I will stop and pass the baton back to the moderator. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akhavan, for your talk. It was so amazing. I really loved how you talked about your personal story and then about the history of human rights. I think it was really helpful for us all. So now we can have our time for question and answer. So if you have a question, you can write it in the chat and I will read it out loud. So we have a question from Kurosh, and he says, what are your thoughts about the inequitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines? Rich countries are buying up the supply of vaccines. It will turn out that low-risk young people in rich countries will receive the vaccine sooner than healthcare workers in low-income countries.
That's a very good question. And obviously, it is a reflection of inequality, both within societies and globally. And one could say the same thing that you are saying in respect of access to the vaccine, in respect of access to healthcare, to education, to a whole host of other privileges and benefits that we take for granted in our prosperous part of the world. But I want to step back and observe how truly remarkable the pandemic is. And we could each ask ourselves, how do we see the world differently today than we did before this minute microscopic particle completely turned the world upside down? And it reminded us perhaps of a few things, among which is the fragility of human life. Perhaps in our technologically induced arrogance and self-confidence, we forgot how truly vulnerable we are. And above all, it taught us the value of social solidarity, that either we all collaborate in the name of a greater good, or we will all suffer. And I want to reflect on the fact that the pandemic actually has a very low mortality rate, perhaps less than 0.1%. Ebola, by contrast, had a mortality rate of some 80%. And when we speak about how the pandemic began, how the loss of natural habitats has increased in recent decades, the incidence of such outbreaks, and what may lay around the corner, we begin to see once again that the fundamental lesson of the pandemic and preventing the next one, which may be even worse, is one of world unity, is a question of trying to address the root causes of these public health crisis and appreciating that boundaries don't matter anymore. In 14th century Europe, it took several months for the bubonic plague to migrate from the steppes of Central Asia on a boat that sailed from the Black Sea to the Sicilian port of Messina in what is now Italy. And of course, within a few years, half of Europe's population had died because of the bubonic plague. Well, today, all it takes is one airplane ride to spread a virus across the world. So I think that these are incredible learning opportunities for us to move even further towards grasping the understanding of our interdependence and the fact that we all have a common interest.
Thank you. Our next question is from Pamela, and she asks, how is the Baha'i community involved in addressing human rights violations?
That's a very good question, but a very difficult one to answer, because human rights, of course, I'm a law professor, I'm a lawyer, and we can talk about human rights in terms of, I don't know, the Constitution of the United States, the Charter of Rights in Canada. Every country has its own legal instruments which enshrine the protection of free speech, life, liberty, and security of the person. But I think we have to understand human rights in a much more holistic and organic way, beyond merely legal norms and beyond these individualistic ideas we have, that human rights is about my freedom, it's about my autonomy to the exclusion of interference by others. When we speak about human rights in a more organic sense, we realize that beyond respect for freedom of belief and conscience and freedom of assembly and all of these other issues, there's also an aspect of social solidarity, which we forget in our highly individualistic, self-centered societies. So when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the right to food, the right to education, the right to a vaccine, and all of these other dimensions of what allows us to safeguard the dignity of the human person, we begin to see that the Baha'i vision of the unification of all peoples in one civilization is founded essentially on solidarity with spiritual roots. Because in a sense, it's famously said that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. The reason why evil things happen in the world isn't necessarily because of evil people, but it's because of the masses who are apathetic and indifferent towards injustice. So when we look at the Baha'i worldwide community, which is some 6 or 7 million people in virtually every corner of the world, and Baha'i communities are exceptionally diverse exactly because that's the message. The message is that we must all, if you like, unite under the same tent. So there are Baha'is in the Amazon rainforest, or members of isolated tribes. There are Baha'is in China, in Iran, in America, from all stripes and backgrounds. There were racially mixed Baha'i communities in South Africa, even at the height of the racist apartheid regime. There are Baha'is in India who come from different castes, who otherwise would never sit in the same room. So in a sense, the Baha'i community is a global ongoing experiment as to how we can all come with our unique backgrounds and identities and concerns and unite in a greater spiritual consciousness, cognizant of all that binds us together. So returning to your question of how Baha'is contribute to human rights, well, I know probably a disproportionate number of Baha'is who are human rights lawyers or social workers, or who are struggling for women's equality, or who are fighting against racism. And one could speak about those as very direct contributions to creating a culture of human rights. But I would also say that the very act of reimagining society, of trying to build communities from the grassroots up based on that sense of mutual respect and compassion and solidarity, that to me is the most revolutionary way of fighting for human rights, because ultimately what brings lasting change is not just an election of this or that political party, which may be important, but it's the seismic grassroots shifts in human consciousness. Those are the changes that truly bring about historical transformation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Janan, and they ask, what advice do you have for Baha'i students pursuing law?
Have a very high hourly rate if you can get away with it. Well, there is so much that can be said. The legal profession, of course, can be a cause for good and a cause for bad, like any other profession. And in North America in particular, of course, the legal profession has disproportionate importance and influence, which is not necessarily a good thing. But I would say that we all have a responsibility, especially those of us who are privileged enough to have gone to university, to have had a law degree or a medical degree or whatever the case may be, to use that power responsibly. And I wouldn't say to everyone that you should all become human rights lawyers. No, because there are many different ways in which you can contribute to social betterment and to serve humanity. But you have to ask yourself uncomfortable questions, because the ego will always trick you into believing that you can take the easy way out and still pay lip service to some politically correct platitudes and engage in, what is it called, virtue signaling. Whereas the soul is your authentic self and will tell you that you must always pay a price for your belief. So yes, sometimes you may have to earn less money. You may have to be less competitive. You may have to be more compassionate, more selfless in order to be able to use your profession in a way that will genuinely help people. So my answer is not that you as a lawyer should become, I don't know, a corporate lawyer as opposed to a refugee lawyer, or each of you has your unique talents and passions and opportunities. No two of us are identical, and it's wonderful that each person will have their own journey. But you must always ask yourself the honest question of, am I following my ego or my soul? Am I using the opportunities that I have to genuinely serve humanity, or am I just pretending that I'm doing good so that I don't feel guilty or what have you?
Thank you. Our next question is from Helen, and she says, quote, "Until we experience injustice, we will never understand why justice is important. I appreciated this statement of yours during the talk today. I have experienced a lot of injustice during my life, which has sensitized me to the importance of justice. Do you think that those of us who have suffered injustice have a responsibility to speak out more in order to awaken others?"
I would say yes. And this is remarkable because sometimes we think that, okay, if someone is a victim of injustice, then they have a right to be bitter and angry. And I would say that the contrary is true, that by experiencing injustice, we have an opportunity to transcend our lower self, to transcend that part of our self which is prone to gravitating towards those base feelings of anger and bitterness. And I'm not saying that it is easy to be treated unjustly and then to simply sweep it under the carpet and move on. But if we look historically at the greatest leaders that we've had, they have invariably suffered. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was actually a terrorist. He was with the African National Congress, and he was going around blowing things up, perhaps for a just cause, but out of anger. He was put in a prison in South Africa for 27 years. He was robbed of his life. And when he was finally released, when the racist system came to an end and there were sort of racial democratic elections, the first thing he did was to forgive those who had tormented him. And that was his power. That's why we remember Nelson Mandela today. So in a sense, I don't think that we should all be going around suffering. This is not what I'm trying to suggest. But when we feel injustice, whether the injustice is against us or against our neighbor, then that is a moment of awakening. It's a moment when we begin to understand that we all have a choice to either ennoble humankind or to gravitate towards those base instincts of selfishness. And in a sense, those who have suffered have a kind of double burden. They have a double burden to reclaim their own humanity. But through reclaiming their own humanity, they can also be the greatest teachers for those who are indifferent. And I'll give you one example. In Canada, we have, of course, our historical injustices against the indigenous peoples, who are maybe 4 or 5% of our population. And today, the indigenous peoples are experiencing a cultural renaissance, and they have a disproportionate impact on Canadian culture because of their spiritual understanding of human nature, because of their understanding of our place in the universe, of our relationship with nature. And I would dare say, in light of what I said about the dangers of catastrophic climate change and our materialistic way of life, that groups like indigenous peoples and others who were marginalized historically may well end up being the greatest leaders that we have because of their suffering, if one allows that suffering to lead to a better, ennobling place rather than a place of anger and bitterness and self-destruction. And I will just add one last point, one last story, which I cannot resist sharing with you. When I was in Rwanda, as you know, there were just horrible stories during this violence, genocidal violence in 1994. One of my friends by the name of Jean-Paul Samputu, who was an aspiring musician, he discovered that his next door neighbor, his friend Vincent, had actually killed his father. And as you can imagine, the grief and the rage consumed him. He began this downward spiral of self-destruction, of alcoholism, of drug abuse, of attempts at suicide. None of this should be a surprise if we understand what overwhelming grief and rage does to our soul when we don't have when we don't have the spiritual tools, if you like, to deal with it. Now, Vincent hit the bottom of the abyss, but he had his epiphany, he had his moment of spiritual awakening, and he began to heal, and he resumed his musical career. Today, he's a very well-known artist in Africa in particular. And then one day news came to him that his friend Vincent had been captured and that he would be put on trial before a village council in a kind of traditional ceremony. He traveled back to Rwanda from the United States. He met his friend in front of all of the people in his village, and he said to him, "I forgive you." And people thought that he had lost his mind. And when I spoke with Jean-Paul, he said, "I forgave him to save myself, because the rage and the grief was devouring me, was consuming me." And the Buddhists have a wonderful saying which says that anger is like drinking poison, thinking that you will kill your enemy. So all this to say that the combination of suffering and injustice with spiritual enlightenment is an extraordinary combination that will create a new generation of outstanding leaders and spiritual luminaries.
Thank you. Our next question is from Giti, and she asks, during this isolation time due to COVID, as an individual, how can we help to promote human rights and equality for all without getting involved in politics?
This is a very good question. It depends on what we mean by politics. There's a difference between politics and partisan politics. There is a politics that divides, and there's a politics that unifies. Politics is simply the exercise of power, and it's an integral part of every human society. In every human society, from the smallest tribe or even just a family or a local community, all the way to the United Nations and the halls of power in Washington and London and Beijing and what have you, power is being exercised. Some people have more power, some people have less power. Some people commit injustice, others fight for justice. So I think the question is not so much how can we stay away from politics, but how can we stay away from partisan politics, from divisive ideologies and patterns of behavior that instead of curing the disease, make it even worse. And part of the answer to that is what we've been discussing today. What does it really mean to bring about lasting change? Of course, sometimes you need to go out in the streets and protest and go and vote for your favorite candidate in the elections. And sure, all of those are part of how we exercise power in society. But I would say that the conversations that we have around the dinner table with our friends and family is also part of how we exercise power, how we reimagine society and the way that we relate to each other. And I would say that it's easier to go out there and to raise our fist and to protest than it is to scrutinize our own behavior and to think about how we could become better people. how we treat our next door neighbor, or that person at work, or that person at school, or what have you. I've dealt with political leaders of all stripes, and I can tell you how disconcerting the exercise of power is, how incredibly cynical political culture is, how we need a profound shift, because the system that we have currently rewards bad behavior. People who are narcissistic, deceptive, treacherous, manipulative, beholden to the rich and powerful, they rise to the top. People who are authentic, who are humble, who are thoughtful, are very rarely the people that end up in power. And that's a reflection of our own culture. We need to change our own ideas of who is really a leader. What does it mean to be a leader? Does a leader simply mean getting power at all costs and saying a few appealing sound bites to excite people in a rally, or what have you? Or is it about the power of example? Is it about humility? Is it about selflessness? Is it about sacrifice? And I would just say one last thing, if you permit me. It's too easy to once again feel virtuous by paying lip service to the right things, right? Politicians can come and say, yes, we believe in equality for women, we believe in healthcare, we believe in this, we believe in that. And those are the good ones, right? But at the end of the day, how is power really distributed in society? Are all those sort of nice, flowery statements just subterfuge, window dressing to pretend as if we are virtuous and doing good in the world? Or are we really willing to bring about the painful changes, which will mean, for example, that the billionaire class will have to have a little bit less wealth so the people at the bottom don't have to live in squalor and misery? It's too easy just to say the right things, and much more difficult to actually exemplify in your actions what you believe in. So we need to be a bit skeptical about what change really means, which goes back to what I said earlier, that real lasting change comes from the grassroots. It comes when our communities change. It comes when our places of work and education and relations with our neighbors. And that's how you really bring about a fundamental shift in how things are done in the world, including our idea of politics.
Thank you. Our next question is from Bill, and he asks, can you address the dynamics of dehumanization that sets the stage for civil unrest, violence, and ultimately of genocide?
This is a very good question. And, every act of violence, every act of injustice is preceded by the dehumanization of others, right? We cannot mistreat or disregard someone who we see not just as our equal in a formal legal sense, but with whom we have empathy. If we see in the face of others a shared humanity, well, we are less wont to treat them with contempt. And this goes back to the struggle, the epic struggle, I would say, between selfishness and selflessness, between the ego and the soul, and the duality of human nature. There is a side of us which can be incredibly evil, horrible, selfish, greedy, aggressive. But at the same time, there is another side of us which is capable of exceptional nobility. And sometimes we read about, let's say, the Schindlers of the world, in the middle of the Holocaust, risked his life to save thousands of people. And I can tell you, in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in all the places that I went to, there were those type of people. And many of them were just ordinary people who, when the time came, rose to the occasion. Mona was one of them. So how do we understand this duality of human nature? Well, one of them goes back to what kind of culture we're conditioned by. If our culture celebrates selfishness, self-indulgence, superficiality, then we should not be surprised that our society begins to unravel. And populist hatred appeals to the lowest common denominator. The easiest way to identify yourself, the most primitive, base way to identify yourself is by hating someone else. It's appealing. Why? Because it's effortless. Instead of searching for meaningful solutions, instead of assuming responsibility, you blame the others. And when that sort of construction of self and other escalates past a certain point, at the extreme end of the spectrum, it takes the form of ethnic cleansing and genocidal violence. So I would say that hatred and violence are the greatest signs of weakness and cowardice. And showing compassion and forgiveness and solidarity are the greatest signs of strength. And I would just add one small point. Jean-Paul Sartre, the great existential philosopher, wrote a book on anti-Semitism in European civilization. And he famously said that the Jew, because anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews, the Jew exists in the mind of the anti-Semite. If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him, which is a remarkable thing to say, because hatred is not about the reality of the victim. It's about the reality of the perpetrator. It's about the need of the perpetrator to construct his or her identity by demonizing someone else, by projecting onto that group or person a reality which has nothing to do with who that person or group really is. So when we reach a certain level of spiritual enlightenment, we realize that hatred and violence is not just an injustice against the other, but it is also an injustice against our own self. It's a denial of our own humanity and our own potential.
Thank you. Our next question is from Masood, and he asks, based on your experience for humanity in general, how much progress have we made to have human rights be recognized and appreciated throughout the world, and in Iran in particular? What is being done to speed up the injustices being done?
These are all very good but difficult questions. Well, you know, as I explained, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations only in 1948, 75 years ago, which is a whisper in the passage of time against thousands of years of recorded history. And most of history, as we all know from binge watching Game of Thrones, which is the best history lesson anywhere, is that history is extremely violent. Gibbons, who wrote the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, one of the greatest works in Western history, said that history is about the follies, crimes, and misfortunes of mankind. So we cannot take for granted that today we even have an idea of human rights. The idea of the right to life. We imagined, oh, well, the right to life is logical, where for most of human history, there was no such thing as the right to life. The more powerful basically murdered and raped and pillaged and did whatever they wanted to those that were weaker. It was in the name of racism, colonialism, fascism, communism. There was always some ideology or other which justified violence. So in that sense, we need to step back and realize that we are in an incredibly fortunate place in history, that today, even Iran, which is violating human rights, has to come to the United Nations and say, oh, but we're not violating human rights. They have to deny that they're violating human rights because they cannot deny that human rights are an obligation under international law. And not just a legal obligation, but the basis of legitimacy in the international community. And even in Iran, which is an authoritarian, tyrannical, and violent state, the regime, like many other authoritarian regimes, has to pretend that it is respecting human rights, has to try and either justify or conceal its human rights violations. And that means perhaps that they are a bit more careful about what they would do if the world did not shine a spotlight on their crimes and misdeeds. So in that sense, while there is a lot to despair about in the world, I would still say that for the first time in human history, we accept in principle that human life is sacred, that all human beings inherently have dignity, and that discourse itself has, over the past century, profoundly reshaped the ideas that we have about power and politics and progress.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Payam, and he asks, with everything going on in the world, it's sometimes hard to believe that we are better off today than we were 10 years ago. Having said that, we know that progress can happen in fits and starts. As you survey the last decade, what are some glimmers of hope, some of the truly positive changes that you have seen take place in society?
Yes, well, I think that we can't look at progress, in terms of, a linear progression, that every day is going to be better than the next. It's more like a meandering river, which turns left here, turns right there. Sometimes it goes downhill, sometimes uphill. But I think we need to step back and first of all realize that our own lifespans are quite insignificant in the greater perspective of history. And even in our own lifespans, we're witnessing, extraordinary exponential change. Imagine how the world was before the Industrial Revolution. Until the Industrial Revolution, which began perhaps somewhere in 18th century Europe, throughout history, we had slavery, we had feudalism, we had sort of absolutist monarchies. We had certain ideas about society and belonging and the exercise of power and the role of men and women. And then with industrialization, which took place perhaps over 1.5 centuries, so-called Industrial Revolution, we had mass migration to the cities. We had an unprecedented boost in productivity, the prolongation of lifespan for human beings, and a whole host of other things, the rise of liberal ideals, ideals of equality and the rule of law and democracy. Now, why do I mention this? Because today historians, are still writing about how the Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed the course of human history. How will future historians write about the internet, the age of the internet, which is barely 30 years old? So the World Wide Web emerged basically in 1991, the same year as the end of the Cold War. And the technology that we're using today to speak to each other is basically 15 years old, which is absolutely nothing in the passage of time. And when we look at the generational differences from the baby boomer generation, Generation X, Generation Z, and so on and so forth, we see the really incredibly dramatic shifts in consciousness. Well, I can tell you that my children's view of the world is fundamentally different than mine, and I'm grateful for that. Their consciousness about everything from gender equality to social engagement to respect for the environment puts to shame my generation. And I'm very grateful that we are seeing a younger generation that are rejecting these obsolete unjust and self-destructive ways of looking at the world. So what am I trying to get at? We shouldn't be too concerned about what happens in the news cycle, right? One day we have good news, one day we have bad news, one day the elections go the way we want, another day it doesn't, one day the stock market is up or down. Those are all little bumps in the road. They don't really matter that much. What matters is the arc of history. And what we have witnessed from the 19th century onwards is the irresistible forces of global integration, which no leader, no matter how powerful, can stand in the way of. And remember that in 1844, when Samuel Morse sent the first telegraph from, it was the US Capitol, right? It was the building of the US Capitol to the train station in Baltimore, I believe. And his message was, "What hath God wrought?" This was the famous words that appeared in the first ever telegraph. Prior to that telegraph, the quickest way of communication had been, throughout thousands of years of recorded history, either by carrier pigeon or more likely by horse. So you basically had to take a message and gallop by horse and deliver it to the recipient. And within a few years of that first telegraph, they were laying submarine cables connecting the United States with Britain. And there was this famous telegraph from the American president to Queen Victoria at the time. Now, fast forward from that and the steamship and the steam engine and, you know, these basic technologies to the world that we have today of instant communication. So I don't think that we are able to appreciate how profoundly revolutionary this day is because we are in the middle of it. But I will wager that future historians for many centuries will be writing about the exact age that we are in today. And it will necessarily involve some ugliness, some confusion, some chaos, some turmoil, because the old order is collapsing. And very often when you see those outbursts of hatred and misogyny and racism and greed and anger and all of these, you know, very disturbing trends, I would see it more as the dying convulsion of a world which will soon be relegated to the trash heap, rather than something that we should be losing sleep over. Instead of being full of despair and angst, we should just roll up our sleeve and build that new world, because history, I believe, is on the side of those that want to bring about that change.
Thank you. Our next question is from Manije, and she asks, "Thank you, Dr. Akhavan, for your talk and wonderful example of life dedicated to the HHRR. I would appreciate if you could kindly share some of your thoughts and experiences about victims, not only of war crimes, but the violation of HHRR in the name of culture or religion, collective rights, specifically referring to women's and girls' rights."
I'm sorry, HHRR, forgive me, I'm not clear on what that is.
I'm not sure. I thought maybe you would know. Maybe if Manija could write in the chat what she means by that, and then we can come back to that question. But until then, Wilmer asks, "Thank you so much, Dr. Akhavan, for such a meaningful, thought-provoking, and insightful talk. You have shared the history of how governments and international institutions have been brought into existence, ignored, and taken advantage of genocide. Could you please share your opinion about why and how should we trust the same governments and institutions to make the wisest decisions about the current pandemic? Are we witnessing the signs of genocide at the global level? Are we in the blink of a tyrannical regime at the global level? As a Baha'i, what could be our position in this great conjunction?" Thank you, Dr. Akhavan.
These are very good questions, and I don't think I can do justice to them, really. But should we trust those in power to do the right thing? Not really. I mean, you know, on the one hand, you know, I'm certainly not one to whatever, you know, advocate, you know, overthrow of governments and violence, and that's not what I'm saying. I think we need to respect governments. We need to have law. We need to have order. But we need, as I said, to explain, to understand that the real change is not going to be brought about by a few political elites. The real change comes from the bottom up, which is what I sort of tried to explain earlier. In a sense, political leadership is a reflection of culture, is it not? If a culture likes to have a strong man who is, I don't know, very authoritarian, very macho or whatever, well, that's a reflection of that culture. And even if a culture is not democratic, every culture, in some respects, every leader reflects to some extent the culture of that society. Even in an authoritarian system where you don't have democratic elections, people have to have a leader who they respect. And the idea of who we respect is conditioned by a whole set of assumptions. So I'll you know, give you an example of male versus female leadership and how in different societies the pandemic has been addressed. So some people will look, for example, at the heads of government, heads of state in countries like New Zealand, countries like Finland, which have female leaders who, it's not just the fact of being female, because where Margaret Thatcher was female as well, and she was the Iron Lady, but it's more perhaps governing based on what we could call very generally feminine ideals, cooperative models, as opposed to competitive models of governance. So these very subtle shifts in political culture can have far-reaching consequences. Sometimes the change that we want is much more subtle than we think it is, which is why I went back to explaining that the relations that we have with our next door neighbor, with our colleagues at work, with our fellow students at school, and above all with our own families, our own relations, these are the roots for the mighty tree of civilization. So yes, we should be politically informed. We should be socially engaged. We should know what is happening out there. What are the debates of the day? What is conducive to human betterment? What is not? We should not bury our head in the sand and wish those things to go away, but we should focus on our own power and agency. We have a lot more power than we imagine. And when we think power is all about who gets elected in Washington and who is debating what at the United Nations General Assembly, we begin to undermine our own agency because we think, oh my goodness, what can I do? I'm not a billionaire. I'm not Jeff Bezos. I'm not the president. I'm not. And so that's why I'm saying that when we understand that the tide of history is irresistibly in favor of this radical change in the very conception of human society, in a spiritual conception of civilization, then we can have more confidence that the seemingly insignificant things that we do on a daily basis are actually a situation where we are the change that we want in the world. And I'm going to just say one small story once again. One of my friends in Canada, Chief Lafontaine, who's in Winnipeg, Manitoba, he went to the residential schools and, you know, for some years until, you know, the 1970s and 80s, Indigenous children were being taken forcibly away from their communities. They were put in sort of white Christian schools to be so-called, you know, civilized. And of course, generations of children experienced a tremendous trauma. And this explains in many respects the tremendous difficulties that many of our Indigenous communities have. So some years ago, the Canadian Prime Minister offered an apology in Parliament. He stood up and he said, I apologize to our indigenous peoples for this injustice. And later that day, Chief Fontaine received a knock on his front door, and he opened the door, and his next door neighbor, who were an elderly immigrant couple that couldn't really speak English that well, had a plate of cookies and muffins for him. And they said that, we heard what has happened to your people, and we are so sorry. We want to give you this gift as an expression of our sympathy. Now, that is seemingly such a small act, right? Just thinking about who is my next door neighbor and what could I do to just put a smile on my next door neighbor's face. But Chief Lafontaine tells me that that for him was a transformative experience in terms of his healing, in terms of how he could reclaim his humanity. So don't ever underestimate how these small transactions of compassion and empathy and love can profoundly change the dynamics of our society. And indeed, it's the cumulative effect of those seemingly small, insignificant acts that ultimately brings about the deep changes in our society.
Thank you. So Manijis says that HHRR stands for human rights. So her question reads, thank you, Dr. Akhavan, for your talk and wonderful example of your life dedicated to human rights. She would appreciate it if you could kindly share some of your thoughts and experiences about victims, not only of war crimes, but the violation of human rights in the name of culture or religion, collective rights, specifically referring to women's and girls' rights.
It's a very good question. And once again, I cannot possibly do justice to it, given its complexity. But one of the ideas that we have about culture, of course, is that culture is static. Very often we think culture is like a fossil in a museum. Well, cultures are inherently dynamic. Cultures are always changing, especially in today's world where we are bombarded with so many cultural influences, some good, some bad, but it's impossible today, except for the most isolated, tribes in the most remote corners of the world, and even there, to be completely isolated and in a kind of silo, if you like. So cultures are all being mediated and renegotiated all the time. And with it too, the idea of the role of women is being challenged in all sorts of ways. Now, sometimes we think about traditional societies and we think, oh, well, traditional societies are patriarchal, and in traditional societies, women are powerless, and modern societies emancipate women and give them more power. Well, yes, but we shouldn't be too quick to judge either, because in some traditional societies, we have matriarchies. We have women who actually had a lot of power. So the idea of the role of women may not be as straightforward as we think it is. Perhaps in the West, we're more concerned about the glass ceiling and equal opportunity in career and success, but a feminist from Egypt or Iran will maybe think about the role of the mother in society, and how, the grandmother who has 5 generations alive and 100 people at her beck and call is actually extremely influential. I can tell you my grandmother was. So the idea of the place of women, which isn't just about the place of women, but also the place of men, and feminine ideals, which are not necessarily exclusive to women, I think teach us that we have a lot more to learn. We have a lot more deep introspection and searching as we try to reimagine our cultures. And of course, Abdul Baha, the son of Allah, famously said that men and women are like the 2 wings of the bird of humanity, and not until both wings are developed can the bird fly, which means that women's rights are also a men's problem. A misogynist culture not only oppresses women, but it also oppresses men. Because going back to the idea that dominating and controlling others is a sign of weakness, is a sign of one's, is a negation of one's own humanity. Well, the man who needs to control and dominate a woman is not a strong man, but is, to the contrary, a very weak man who's desperate to pretend that he is strong by controlling and dominating others. And the same thing could be said about racism and a whole lot of other behavior, which masks, our own, negation of our own self.
Thank you. So our next question will be our last question, just in the interest of time. Mona asks, thank you very much for sharing your learnings with us. What frame of reference do you use when speaking about human rights injustices in Iran? How do we balance not taking a position on political decisions of the government, like forced hijab, with a sense of obligation to speak up about the injustice?
It's a very good question for which there is no easy answer. The best that I can say is trial and error. We learn as we go along. But that doesn't mean that we should be petrified and so fearful that we don't get up and become involved in the real world, if you like. The real world is messy, it's complicated. So we have to become engaged. We have to, through a process of both action and reflection, you get experience, life experience, you learn both through your successes and mistakes. And then you reflect more deeply and you refine your method, your approach, your understanding. So as I said, it's a journey. It's a journey. The journey is the destination. Sounds like a bumper sticker, but it's truly one of the wisest things I've heard, that we learn as we go along and we can strive for perfection. But perfection is the enemy of the good. None of us is going to achieve perfection. All we can do is every day to be deep thinking, reflecting, thoughtful people who are trying their best to be meaningfully engaged in the world around them. And we will figure it out. We will figure it out as we go along. And the best advice I heard is make sure that your next mistake is better than your last one.
Thank you so much for your talk again, Dr. Akhavan. I think everyone really enjoyed it, and this follow-up discussion really, I think, deepened all of our understandings.
Thank you. Thank you.
So our next week's speaker will be Mrs. Layli Miller-Murrow, and her topic will be, is justice or unity the goal of a Bahá'í perspective? And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern Standard Time, so please invite your friends and family. And again, if you're new to the Bahá'í Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please fill out the Google form that we'll put in the chat below. Have a great week, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Bye.